Welcome to RealFixesRealFast.com. Today we're working on a 97 Dodge Dakota 4-wheel drive. It has bad lower ball joints and an inner tie rod end. We'll show you the procedures how to change those. Of course, you have to take the tire off first. Now we're going to take the ball joint off and replace it, but to do that we have to take the spindle off. So you have to take the caliper and the rotor and everything off. To take the tie rod loose, you have to take the castle nut loose. Just loosen it. Now on the tie rod end, you can see the stud that sticks up is beveled. That's why when you hit it with the hammer, it should just pop loose. You take the caliper off. You need to put some type of a pry bar in there to push the piston back on the caliper. That'll allow the caliper to slide off the rotor. You need to take either a strap or a hook or something and hold that caliper up out of the way. One quick easy way is just take like a coat hanger and make yourself a little hook out of it. Hook on both ends. And take the castle nut off the lower ball joint. Don't take the nut completely off. Leave it threaded on a few threads so when you get it loose it won't just drop on the floor with you. You gotta take the castle nut off the top ball joint. Same thing, just as a safety so it doesn't fall out of there. Leave a few threads on. Okay, you can see after you smack it a few times, the spindle should come down off of that stud on the ball joint. Now once you take your nut off, there's a washer in there. Sometimes you just use a little magnet and pull that out. You need to put some kind of support underneath the lower control arm to raise it up. You can put a pry bar in here, pry it down so that you can get your upper ball joint loose from the spindle. You want to make sure you got a couple of threads holding on this. Now you can see why it's important to keep that nut threaded on there so that when you bang it, it won't just fall on the ground. Now your axle is going through the middle. You just have to tap on that kind of lightly to get the axle out of the middle. Now the top's held on with the snap ring. Now if you use an air hammer on this, it's kind of the easy way to get it out. Not that it's easy. Now your ball joint's out. Now we're also going to change this tie rod in because the inner tie rod joint is bad. There's the outer end and the inner, and there's a rubber boot over it that covers it and protects it. Now you see the new tie rod end held up to the old one, and when we turn that around so you can look at the end of it, you can see that it's threaded, but it also has two flat surfaces on it that you can get onto to be able to turn it. You can see it's got a flat side on each edge. Now the center link portion of it should stay in place, and then you just turn the tie rod end off. Now you've got to break this nut loose, and the tie rod end is going to turn and twist on you. So I'll hold it in place, put like a crescent wrench or a regular wrench, and then slide the arm of it down inside the hole where the ball joint went. That's going to hold that wrench in place, because you can get some torque on it that way. Then when you put another wrench on the nut, you can actually break it loose. Otherwise it's just going to twist and twist on you. Let's take the tie rod end off. Now the outer tie rod end was okay, we're only replacing the inner one. So we'll screw that back on and reuse the outer tie rod end. Now you can finish taking off the inner tie rod end from the center link. Now you can see it just simply threads in place and it goes right into the end of the center link. Put a little bit of Loctite on the end of the new tie rod end, and then it simply just threads in. Just put your wrench on it and tighten it down.
It's got a pretty good sized bolt in here, so we put about 100 pounds torque on that to tighten that down so it'll stay put.
Now we're going to put the outer tie rod end back on. Now there's no way to make this actually perfect. They are going to have an alignment after this, but you can count your threads and you can get it close anyway, and then you will have to recommend or do an alignment.
We've installed the tie rod in. We go ahead and tighten this down. Even though we think we've got it roughly close to where it came out, you want to tighten this down, because if you happen to leave this loose and a different person is doing the alignment than what installed the part, if it happened to be lined up perfectly, you got lucky, then the alignment guy would think it was right and not go to this. So you want to go ahead and tighten this up, even though you may be loosening it later to adjust that, just in case the person doing the front end install is a different person that's doing the alignment. We're going to check this new ball joint to see if it's a directional ball joint. Some ball joints are made so that they'll only pivot one direction but not the other. And if that's the case, you want to make sure you line it up right, because that lower control arm is made so that when it pivots, that ball joint flexes in that one direction with it. We're going to check this one. If it's got a specific direction to it, you want to put that in line with the direction it's going to need to pivot. If it's not, and it'll go all directions, then you don't need to worry about that. So this one will go this way, that way, that way. So this one is not directional, so this one can be installed without specifically lining it up.
Now where the lower ball joint goes in right here is a grease zerk. Now when we're looking at this, I can't get it real close on the camera, but it's damaged, probably smashed when he was four-wheel driving or something. So you do have to have a good grease zerk. So if that's the case, take it out, put in a new grease zerk. Now when you take the ball joint out, you'll need to clean up the surface. But if you notice, that's the hole where the grease zerk puts the grease in. So when you put the grease from the grease zerk, you can see on this ball joint that goes into this passageway, there's a little hole there. So the grease actually goes into this slot that goes back and forth, and it'll go into that hole and then grease the joint on the inside. But you do not have to line that hole up to the grease zerk, because the grease will travel in that slot. Take some emery cloth, clean out the inside of that joint where the ball joint goes. You don't have to do any heavy duty sanding, you're just trying to smooth it down and knock off any burrs or anything that might have been created when you drove that joint out. And then you need to take a rag and clean it, because any of that dust that you did sand off of that with the emery cloth, if it gets in that grease hole, then that'll travel around and mix with that grease and get in the ball joint. So be sure and clean that out good. Now we're ready to install the ball joint. You'll need a ball joint press. Many times you guys are used to using a kit like this that has everything in it. Now you see, when we actually press the joint in, at the very bottom there's a solid ridge, and that ridge will actually anchor into the mount here from the bottom up. So it's going to travel from the bottom up the important points to remember is that that has to travel at the top. So you're going to put the bottom of the joint around the stud, and then you need to have a spacer at the top. Now when you're trying to pick your spacer, pick a spacer that the ball joint will actually travel in, so it won't catch on anything. And then that spacer should set on top of the control arm. So when that ball joint is pressed up, it'll travel into that spacer. Now it's important, once you put this up here, you do not hammer on the bottom of this stud. That's why they make a ball joint press. Sometimes it's a little bit of a juggling act to put all these pieces in place, but you've got a pin that slips up inside the screw down. You've got a top, the spacer, and then the bottom goes over the stud. Get all your pieces lined up straight. Make it just kind of finger tight. Now it's important here that your ball joint is started straight, and then it goes into the hole in the ball joint press, and then the top is all set. Now you can just use an impact and drive it down. Now when you're done, it should bottom out and not go up anymore. Then just reverse the threads to loosen it all up. And then when you look at the top of the ball joint, you've got the groove in here for the snap ring. Make sure that it is up far enough that that snap ring easily goes into that notch.
If you look at where this ball joint has the cotter pin hole, it is pointed at this angle. Myself, I always like to re-center those and make it so it goes front to rear, so that as the knuckle goes up on there, it's easy to put the cotter pin in. So you can take your pair of vice grips and you can turn that way, it's front to rear with the vehicle. This boot that's going to go on here has got a notch in it. That notch is, and so after you've put it all together and you're going to use your greaser, grease it. Excess grease as that thing is working going down the road, if it has a little bit too much in it, can exit that, and hopefully it'll exit out to the inside and not come outward where the rotor is. You do not want that excess grease to be on your rotor. So that's the purpose of that slot right there. So whatever grease exits, it exits away from the rotor. You take you some pliers, you get a hold of that lip, be very careful because you can rip that boot. So you just want to be gentle with it and work that boot up on there so it's good and snug.
Now when you put your spindle up, you have to get it under the lower ball joint, and you actually have to get the axle through it as well. So just get it all lined up and then go up into the upper ball joint. The smart thing to do here is already have the castle nut in your hand. So once you get in place, you can put the castle nut on, and that should hold it in place. Now you can swing your top one in, get it in place. Probably going to need a pry bar to pry down on this so that you can get your castle nut on it. Rotate it. Do the same thing. You can rotate it so that your cotter pin will actually be facing the right direction so that you can get it in there. Put your nut on to hold it in place. And then you can let the tension off. Tighten the nuts down. Tighten up the lower ball joint castle nut.
When you get that tight to the right torque, then the next thing you do is go around a little further until you line up that keyway slot for the cotter pin we was talking about earlier.
Slide your tie rod end back into the spindle. Cotter pins in. Once you get everything installed, then you need to grease it. Now this came with no grease. You've got to pump up that boot, so just squirt enough into it until you start seeing it, the boot swell. Now a mistake you can make here is pump that until the grease starts squirting out the boot. That's actually too much. Just pump it until that boot begins to swell up. Now we put the axle back in. We need to tighten up the axle nut. Don't forget the washer that goes underneath it.
Personally, I like to use a 120-pound torque stick to tighten these down with. That way I don't have to worry about the torque on it. Good amount of torque, but not too much. At this point, we're kind of concluded with the ball joint install, so now we're going to put a rotor on it, a caliper on it, a wheel, and brake pads, and have a finished job.